Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our today's webinar, Trump 2.0, the future of Ukraine and European security. Can the EU step up? My name is Sabine Hämmerling. I'm Senior Program Officer for Transatlantic Relations at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Berlin, and I will moderate this session. I'm very delighted that you took the time this morning to join us for this discussion, which is also a presentation of a policy paper that my colleague Roderick Kefferpütz and Rachel Tausenfreund from the DGRP have written for the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and that we have recently published with the title US Election and European Cohesion, Scenario Implication for Ukraine and Transatlantic Security. You can see it now on the screen here and also find the link. And I'm very excited that we have both of them today here for this discussion. In this paper, they examine how the European Union and its member state might adjust their policies in NATO and Ukraine based on hypothetical scenarios that have been sketched in regards to the possible outcomes of the US election. So initially, this included also scenarios for a Harris presidency, but within the next few days, we will publish an updated version that then solely concentrates on a Trump administration. And we also have this publication on the website of the Böll Foundation, in Brussels, in Washington, and in Berlin. So if you haven't read it, please download and read it. And so in less than 6 weeks, Donald Trump will return to the White House with a GOP-controlled Senate and a GOP-controlled House of Representatives. His first term was already regarded as a wake-up call for Europeans, but this time he comes with much more experience, better prepared, and in a dramatically altered geopolitical situation that is characterized by wars in Ukraine, in the Middle East, rising tension in the South China Sea, and with a Europe that is increasingly preoccupied by internal dynamics and conflicts. And there's no doubt that Trump will reshape the transatlantic foreign policy landscape. He reiterated his statement on NATO that the US might withdraw if the other member states fail to meet the 2% target. He also reaffirmed his intention to cut funds for Ukraine. So the EU faces very urgent questions about its security architecture, the future of NATO, and its readiness to step up as a security provider. And this is what we want to talk about today now with you. As in the paper, we want to focus mainly on 3 areas, which are US military and financial support for Ukraine, a negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia, this is how we call it, and the short-term future of NATO. And we would be very happy if this is not only a panel discussion, but if we can get you all involved. So if you have any questions for the panelists, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, normally at the bottom of your screen. And you can do this at any time. We will get to those then later in the second half of the session. And the panelists will be really happy to respond to them. Also, for your information, this webinar is recorded. So I'm excited now to welcome our 2 panelists and authors of the publication, Rachel Tausenfreund and Roderick Kefferpütz, who I will briefly introduce. Hello, nice to see you. So Rachel Tausenfreund has been Senior Research Fellow with a focus on transatlantic relations at DGRP since September 2024. And previously, she was a senior fellow at the geostrategic team for the German Marshall Fund of the United States. From 2015 to 22, she was GMF's editorial director and co-created GMF's Out of Order podcast and is the co-host of Transatlantic Takeaways. Rachel researches on transatlantic relations, domestic and foreign policy, German foreign policy, and as well as on relations between the West and powers of the Global South. And she is a regular commentator in German, US, and European media. Welcome, Rachel.
Hi, thanks. Happy to be here.
Hi. So now I want to introduce my colleague, Roderick Kefferpütz. He is the office director of our office in Brussels. And previously, he worked as a senior analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, covering Sino-Russian relations and China influence in Europe. And before that, he worked at the State Ministry of Baden-Württemberg as a political advisor, speechwriter, and deputy head of the Unit for Strategy and Policy. Before that, he spent 10 years also in Brussels, including 4 years as chief of staff for MEP Renat Butikofer. And I have to mention this, he began his political professional career as a researcher at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in the office in Brussels, Moscow, and Warsaw. Thank you for being here, you both.
Thanks
We
for
have
having
now,
me.
to get started, a little survey where we wanted to get you all in with a question that focuses on our topic today. It should have plopped up now. It's, do you believe the EU is prepared to take on greater responsibility in the field of foreign security? And now I wait for the incoming results. Still waiting. Okay, maybe you can share now the results. We have 71% were pessimistic with no, but 29% who say yes. I mean, this is a little bit 1/3. And I'm curious what our both panelists will respond to this question later. But before we come to this, I wanted to start and look at the incoming US administration. And so, Rachel, if I may start with you. Maybe, I don't know, I'll close this one now. If we look at the incoming administration, I mean, there have been a lot of nominations and appointments already have been met. They came in quite rapidly. And for example, Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor, and at the moment still Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense. Don't know how this ends. So if you look at all these names, how would you assess the current nominations, and what kind of foreign policy agenda, especially in regard to Europe, does this lineup suggest in the field of, like foreign policy agenda? Yes.
Sure. Thanks, Sabina. Well, the fact that the nominations came sort of as quickly as they did, and with the exception of Matt Gaetz, who was mentioned and then had to withdraw, and there's a bit of drama around Pete Hegseth, but in general, one can say the effort has been much more organized than it was the first time around, which is what we had expected. And similarly, what we see in the nominations are people who are Trump supporters, who are in line with Trump. I mean, Marco Rubio, as some might remember, early in the Trump tenure, ran against Trump in the primaries and was an outspoken critic, but that changed already during Trump's first term. And since then, Marco Rubio has been a pretty firm supporter of Trump and has changed his own foreign policy emphasis. Marco Rubio, who, as you said, is not nominated to be Secretary of State, early in his career, you might have called him a neocon. He, was a sort of values-based, freedom-forward, very strong, robust U.S. presence in the world. But he's become more Trumpist in his foreign policy in terms of being a critic of U.S. entanglements, U.S. commitments, but in particular, he's very focused on China. And this is the same also for the proposed national security advisor, Mike Waltz, both of them have a very clear emphasis on China. So on the US need to oppose China, the US need to compete with China, and the idea that China is the challenge that the US needs to focus on, and that everything else is a bit of a distraction. And that is particularly relevant for Europe, because Europe and the war in Ukraine and the conflict with Russia is for Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz rather a distraction from what the US should be focusing on. Secretary of Defense, you mentioned, Pete Hegseth. As you said, it's a little, there's some talk about whether he might not be able to come through the nomination process. He is slightly different than Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz. He's primarily known for being a Fox News talking head. He is more kind of culturally Trumpist, which is to say his main political and foreign policy focus is on attacking the wokeism of the US military and their DEI policies, and he has been a critic of women in combat roles. Where he is positioned in terms of what the US should be doing with China or NATO, this has been, nothing he's particularly focused on. That said, he was a soldier and served in the Forever Wars, and certainly has a Trumpist view on US military entanglements and that they should be minimized. So what this means is there is no one in the foreign and security policy apparatus of the Trump team who is a traditionalist when it comes to US-European foreign and security policy relations, right? So there's no Mathis this time, who thinks that the US role in NATO should remain as it has always been. You have people there who would be ready to challenge NATO more and challenge European partners and be more ready to kind of play the bad cop and the tough guy and use tough love. These aren't people who are anti-NATO. I don't want to give that impression. These are all, people who do think NATO is valuable, with the possible exception of Trump, whose, positions on this are both consistent and inconsistent. Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, they certainly think NATO is valuable. They value the security relationship with European partners, but they would be willing to challenge it more to get Europeans to step up. So as the subtitle goes, and they fundamentally do not agree that the U.S. should be providing 60 to 70% of the European security, basically. So fundamentally, they disagree with the outsized role that the U.S. has played in European security up until now, and that will be a major focus, fundamentally just to retool the relationship, but also with a focus on China. Not only is it an outdated model, but it's particularly an outdated model because the challenge lies elsewhere. So that's the kind of overview of what we're looking at so far.
Thank you, Lord Rachel. Broderick, would you like to add anything? Do you have any thoughts from your side when you look at this nomination picks?
Yeah, thank you, Sabine. I mean, I would really agree with Rachel's assessment. And I think within these dark clouds, there are a couple of silver linings. And one of the silver linings is the one that Rachel mentioned, the fact that some of these candidates that have been proposed are not fundamentally NATO haters. They understand the need and the importance of NATO, but what they want to do is to address this imbalance of the security provider model that exists currently in Europe, which is that the US is basically the main security provider, but the US wants to focus its resources more in the Indo-Pacific region. And in order to do that, it means Europe must step up to the plate. There's a couple other developments that we've seen in Europe now that I think could be read as positive. So, for example, in Trump's telephone call with Chancellor Scholz, or in Trump's telephone call with the president of Finland, I've been told by the Chancellery and others that Trump has been asking a lot of questions. He's been asking a lot of questions about Europeans' thinking on the situation in Ukraine, on what's happening, how they view the war, how they view Russia and the development of the war. So he's been kind of in a listening mode, which is strange because Trump is not necessarily known to be a great listener. Maybe it's because he's been out of the game for a while. Maybe it's because he really wants to understand the dynamics at play, the complexities, build up relationships. I've heard the same in France, that the conversation between Trump and Macron was also listening mode. He's been really asking a lot of questions. So that, first of all, I would say could be a positive. Another positive is that there's actually been a number of Trump administration staffers that have been engaged in policy games or track 1.5 meetings where there have been outreach to their European counterparts. And these Trump staffers have come with actual concrete ideas on what they would expect the EU and Europe to do with regards to the war in Ukraine, with regards to European security. So they've had concrete ideas and expectations on Europe. And I kind of like that because it means they treat Europe serious and they have actual expectations on Europe, and that it's a two-way street. It's a discussion, and it's not well, this is what we want, our way or the highway. At least not so far. So far, it's a discussion. There's listening mode, and there's seeing where the landscape lies. We saw this also in the Notre Dame meeting with Trump, Macron, and Zelensky. So for me, these are first soft, positive developments in spite of overall dark clouds.
Thank you, Roderick. And it sounds quite positive that you both think there is a little bit of leeway when it comes to transatlantic security policy. So you already touched upon this, Roderick, but if we look on the European side, I mean, the European Commission took office on December 1st, and you could really see that they put security and defense high on its agenda. For the first time, they have now a Commissioner for Defense position filled by Andrius Kubilius. He was the former Prime Minister of Lithuania. And also von der Leyen assigned Kaja Kallas as High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs and Security with security policies, which can be read like as a real strong commitment to the support of Ukraine. So if we look at this new commission, and you touched upon this already a little bit, but how would you say has it positioned itself so far, and in which areas is it well prepared to address the challenges Europe is now facing after the election?
Well, this is really a game of two halves, I would argue. The first half, the positive half, is indeed the European Commission. The European Commission has really prepared itself for this Trump administration. It's done a task force. There's a great tableau of European commissioners, first time a defense commissioner, Commissioner Kubilius, as you mentioned. There are plans to have a white paper on the future of European defense. But there's also been very concrete steps or discussions on taking certain steps with regards to building up the European defense industry in support for Ukraine. Just a couple of examples. One example is there has been the idea floated of using unspent European cohesion funds to strengthen the European defense industry. This is unheard of, and that's a big step forward. Second, just 3 days ago, another 4.2 billion economic aid tranche was sent over to Ukraine. So there is continuing movement. And the European Commission has already signaled it'd be willing to work very closely with the Trump administration when it comes to Ukraine and European security. They've signaled the possibility to buy more American weapons. Ursula von der Leyen has signaled the possibility to buy more American LNG gas. The other half of the game, however, is the question of the European Council. Where do the member states stand? And there, it's not so difficult. We see a lot of political instability. In Germany, which is facing an election in February. In France, where the government has fallen, they have to come up with a new government. Poland also will have a presidential election taking place in the first half of the year. And I think the Irish representative to the EU has put it best. She said, "We are totally united until we are tested." And this is the danger. Right now, everybody is saying, look, we are united, we can do this, we can manage this, we can work together with Trump. But what happens if Trump suddenly hits the EU with economic tariffs? What happens if Trump suddenly meets Putin and decides to come to some kind of deal? I think then the splits and the divisions will start emerging. And that's, of course, the difficulty. But so far, so good, I would argue.
Thank you for this assessment. So I would now like then to come to the scenarios you described in the paper, because you chose to plot the different scenarios along the parameter of unity, which is probably one of the most important ones. And I would now like to ask you, Roderick, what can we learn by examining the different potential reactions to the EU to a Trump 2.0 administration in terms of unity? I mean, maybe you can specify here a little bit in regard to the first two areas you described in the paper that focused on support for Ukraine and a negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia.
Sure, happy to. I mean, we looked at the Trump administration under three different scenarios for the EU. A strong EU, which is a united and decisive EU. A split EU, which is not united, but has different levels of decisiveness because member states have different ambitions. And a stuck EU, where the EU is basically united in a status quo, being undecisive, not wanting to take any real leadership. And I think looking at this unity variable, there are 2 points that I would like to make. The first point is the learnings that we've had. And there are 4 learnings. The first learning is the different scenarios and the different areas that we've looked at: support for Ukraine, negotiations or negotiated settlement, Ukraine-Russia, and the future of NATO-European security. These are all interconnected. You can't look at them in isolation from each other. One, support for Ukraine, will affect a negotiated settlement, and all of this affects, of course, the European security order. The second learning that we had was that if you take the split scenario and the stuck scenario, and I invite you, click on the link, read the paper more in depth. If you look at these 2 scenarios, split and stuck, there are not that much differences between them. Because if you're split and you have different levels of ambition, the EU can't have as much action. And if you're stuck, you also can't have much action. You're in the status quo. But if you're in the status quo, in a dynamic environment, it's basically a net loss. So we found these 2 scenarios basically were giving a pessimistic outlook together. The only scenario that was very positive was, of course, the united scenario. 3 more learnings that we had was the EU has leverage. Yeah, that was the third learning. The EU has leverage. It has the reconstruction funds possibly for Ukraine. It has support that it can give to Ukraine. It has the Russian assets. It has membership perspective. So it has a lot of assets available to step up and take on a greater leadership role when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And the fourth learning that we have was the issue of timing. Timing really matters. And luckily, I think we see a lot of action being taken, a lot of talks taking place right now, especially Prime Minister Tusk bringing together the Baltics, the UK, France, Macron bringing together Zelensky, Trump. So we see a lot of pieces are already moving before Trump is getting into office on 20 January. So I think in terms of timing, we need to move fast, and this is happening. And now the second point is that when we looked at the scenarios, the united scenario was, of course, the best one. For support of Ukraine, the united scenario foresaw the EU doing a lot of outreach to Trump in advance. Some of it we're already seeing. We mentioned, for example, Duda. We mentioned the new NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. He's also already reached out. But in a united scenario, we also thought the EU might not be all that optimistic when it comes to support for Ukraine. We saw the EU supporting Ukraine with another financial aid package, with another military package. But after some time in 2025, this conflict of interest between self-defense, making sure Poland has enough tanks and artillery shells, or defense of Ukraine, making sure that they have enough, this conflict of interest will widen and become more pertinent. And especially with the Trump administration demanding more for the Europeans when it comes to European security. And so we came to the assessment that with a united scenario, even then, the Europeans might be less inclined to provide further additional support for Ukraine in the future, and instead will keep back support in order to bump up European security and European defense spending. Negotiated settlement, also a united scenario, foresaw the EU taking a much greater role. The question here really was, is the EU part of the negotiations, or is it just on the sidelines watching Trump do his thing? And we would argue in the united scenario, there is the possibility for the EU to take an active role. And one of the roles it could take is having this peacekeeping force. I mean, you saw it yesterday or today also in the press, Macron already talking with Poland and others about a potential peacekeeping force. Trump administration staffers are looking for a peacekeeping force of around 40,000 soldiers. This could be, if the EU were willing to step up to the plate, or if certain member states together with the UK were willing to step up to that plate, that could be a leverage, an asset that would give the EU the opportunity to be part at the negotiation table. So again, I invite you to look at the united scenarios and all the scenarios that we outlined. There are different scenarios, possibilities, but for us, the united one is obviously the strongest, and they're all interlinked. And the NATO and European security order is obviously also a very big one in that.
Thank you. A question on this again. Do you think, or do you have any concrete steps or the EU should focus on to remain united? I mean, to prevent like individual states to pursue bilateral security agreements with Trump, which will probably, Trump will probably try to undermine this European cohesion. Is there anything that you can do already now?
I think one of the very interesting formats is, of course, the Weimar Triangle format. You know, France, Berlin, Poland, and what would really be ideal to have a Weimar Plus format where you bring in the United Kingdom as well. I think what we're going to have is a kind of circle of member states, because you can't always bring everybody together. But if you have the Weimar Plus triangle, and then you have Poland coordinating also with the Baltic states, and France maybe coordinating with Italy and others, that could ensure that we're all on the same level playing field and we all remain united when it comes to dealing with the new Trump administration. One of the worries that there are currently out there is, of course, that Berlin is incapacitated. We have the election on February 23rd, and German representatives to the EU have made it very clear to the EU that the EU should not make any moves, take no actions, take no developments, because Germany is in the middle of an election campaign and they need to wait until the election campaign is over and a new government is in place, and then we can start working together. That's, of course, very difficult if you're in such a dynamic environment with an unpredictable president in the White House. So one negative factor, unfortunately, coming from Berlin.
I mean, if I may,
Sure.
It's not only difficult, it's impossible and frankly, very stupid. So one would have hoped that the reaction to the Trump victory would have been, the same kind of decisive unity within the very troubled German governing coalition, which, we had the exact opposite reaction. But in a way, what we got, if we sort of translate it to Germany, was an agreement that stuck is not an option for the German coalition, right? That the challenge is so enormous and urgent that the German government needs to be able to function. But I think the idea that, as you said, Roderick, many have in Berlin, that Europe should, wait till Germany gets sorted is exactly the wrong idea. And the Polish initiative, I think, is exactly right. And in a way, because Germany does have a tendency to be a bit of a veto player sometimes in these questions, it might be actually a positive, if one wants to look optimistically. It might work out well for Europe that the other Europeans, a Weimar Plus with Finland led by the Polish government, can start moving forward with these things as long as they keep an eye to what Germany might be able to sign on to, and then the Germans can kind of jump in and rather than kind of breaking the momentum. That said, things are now a problem in France as well, so it's not a good time to be having political upheaval. But to stick with our scenarios, maybe upheaval will lead to unity and decisiveness and is an anti-status quo reaction, which is exactly what one would need now, if you want to take a positive spin on it.
Yeah, a lot is coming together at this moment. Rachel, further question for you. We have seen that Trump picked Keith Kellogg as a special envoy to Ukraine recently, and who has already mentioned some pillars of kind of a peace plan. Could I get your assessment on this?
Sure. Yes, I didn't mention Keith Kellogg in the initial discussion about nominations, but it's an interesting choice, and I think it can be read two ways. So Kellogg is a co-author of a peace plan that was submitted to Trump and also talked about in the media before the election. And, it's not a peace plan that, wants Ukraine to completely capitulate or that is suggesting that Russia should be able to do what it wants. That's not at all the outlines of this, of Keith Kellogg's thinking on this. It is very much this idea, however, that a negotiation needs to happen soon and that the US needs to come in very forcefully. So sort of one, the fundamental argument in this peace plan was to force the sides to negotiate. So if Ukraine doesn't go to the negotiation table, or the US would withhold all support until Ukraine agrees to negotiate. And the reverse of that, if Putin decides or resists negotiation, that the US would then double down its support for Ukraine to sort of force Putin to the negotiation table. So in theory, this sounds fine, right? It sounds like a balanced approach. However, when you consider Putin's actual objectives, which aren't necessarily capturing more territory in Ukraine, I can imagine a dark scenario in which Putin agrees to start negotiations and we enter a kind of, Minsk process, but even worse, whereby Putin is pretending to be interested in some kind of negotiation, but is in the meantime undermining Ukrainian sovereignty and security while he's pretending to negotiate. And then the question is, what does the Trump administration or Keith Kellogg think about that? And that, to me, is the open question. So, but Kellogg is also one of, in line with the new incoming administration that I mentioned before. He's not, anti-transatlantic relations or anti-NATO necessarily, but he is very critical of kind of the slow-moving bureaucratic NATO and a NATO full of underperforming European allies. So I think Kellogg in place in this role of envoy to Ukraine does absolutely mean that the Europeans are going to need to use the assets that they have, are going to have to bring things to the table exactly in line with this peace force that Roderick mentioned that's been discussed, in order to be a positive force in this negotiation, in order to keep the transatlantic relationship, active in this. And if the Europeans are stepping up with conventional forces and this peace force, Europeans plus UK, then, the US, I think, would have no problem continuing to support with air support, reconnaissance, all of these things, as long as the Europeans can utilize their assets. So, Keith Kellogg to me is neither completely clear in one direction or the other. I don't think it has to be a doomsday scenario, but I would underscore that this is again a nomination that means that the Europeans, need to get their act together and put something on the table and push things forward, because if things start to crumble under Keith Kellogg and under Donald Trump, the US is not going to want to come in and pick up the pieces.
Thank you, Rachel. And before I go on, I just wanted to remind the audience that you can put questions in the Q&A box, and the panelists will be happy to answer to them soon. But now I would like to go on and focus on the third area you were focusing on in the paper, which is NATO. And Rachel, European leaders are deeply concerned when it comes to NATO and the new Trump administration, but we already touched a little bit upon that there might be a little bit of leeway, and not everybody in the administration shares his views on this. So what did the scenarios suggest you were sketching in this paper when it comes to NATO?
With the NATO scenarios, it was very much underscoring two of the points Roderick made earlier. One, that all of these things are interconnected, right? You can't think about the short-term future of NATO without thinking about what's going on in Ukraine and with Russia. But secondly, also that we're not living in status quo times, and that therefore a kind of stuck scenario doesn't work, right? Because there's no scenario that we sketched out anyway, where a kind of NATO can just float by. Trump and his administration and the conflict with Russia and the war in Ukraine are forcing NATO to make changes. And so again, of course, the semi-positive scenario was a positive version of a Europeanization of NATO, where the kind of weakening of the European weakening of deterrence that you have from having a weaker Trump and US commitment to NATO and European security, right? I mean, this is just a fact. With everything Trump has said before, there is right now already a weakening of the US part of NATO deterrence and strength. But if the Europeans can compensate partially for the US role, then that leaves NATO in the kind of short to medium term, not weaker and also better set up for the future. So in this scenario, you have, the Europeans finding a resolution to the, long-standing divides over how exactly to get stronger and defense industry conflicts, right? So doing some investing in European defense industry, but also investing in more efficient and cheaper high-tech systems, and finding a way to balance that conflict, which is sort of the fundamental conflict that has kept things from moving forward. And if they get a vision on this, now that, again, I have to say, we did not anticipate the German government collapsing the day after the election. That was not in our scenario.
We weren't that good.
Yeah. That would have been really amazing. But Germany has always been a bit of a blocker to movement here. And you already saw with the Zeitenwende, Germany's position change. So I think it does open the door, sadly not already in January because of the political chaos, but it does open the door, and this was in the scenario, for Europeans to really move forward and start some kind of 5-year plans to increase capacity, move forward to something like this peace force to increase their conventional support of Ukraine, but also their conventional forces in NATO in a way that rebalances the transatlantic burden in the short term, and with a medium-term plan to really rebalance and make NATO, in fact, slightly more European, so that we're looking at a perspective of the US having, 40% of the burden of European security, which is a NATO that, Trump is his slightly own version of things, but that is a version of NATO that Mike Waltz, that Pete Hegseth, that Marco Rubio, that the Republicans would be long-term able to support, and the Democrats as well. So you're looking at then, a NATO that has a much more Europeanized conventional capacity, while the US stays on board for, reconnaissance, a lot of the air protection, and of course the nuclear umbrella. That's what that looks like. And just briefly, split and status quo are a NATO whose deterrence is very, very significantly weakened, because there's nothing stepping in to fill the gap left by US deterrence. And that is a dangerous place to be when you have already one ongoing war in the continent. So of the three, there's one relatively positive scenario for the Europeans, but again, only with decisiveness and unity.
Roderick, would you like to add anything? And do you think like 40% of overtaking the burden is realistic? How do we get there?
I mean, these we will see how these developments pan out in the end, right? What makes me a little bit more optimistic, maybe I'm too much of an optimist, but what makes me a little bit more optimistic is the fact that the narrative has changed in Europe. And I don't think we would have, quite frankly, I don't think we would have seen this if Trump hadn't been elected. With Trump being elected, there was a narrative shift. Suddenly, you had Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck saying we need a Sondervermögen 2.0 for the German armed forces. So again, putting a lot of money into the German armed forces. Suddenly, you have the German foreign minister talk about we should have a 3% of GDP defense target in NATO. Not a 2%, a 3% target in NATO. And, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. So are we just talking about it because we're worried about Trump, or are we actually going to do something about it? And I think there are increasing discussions and increasing possibilities to have some kind of a European financing on defense, be it Eurobonds, be it some kind of a special purpose vehicle with the ESM. But I think if there is any area for common financing, then it could be the area of defense. We needed a lot of financing in other areas as well. We need it in the green transformation and the digital transformation. But I think defense could be the one area where there will be could be a move forward.
Okay, quite I think positive assessment. That is good. We have 50 minutes left. The questions coming in. I have one last one I wanted to ask you, and it's because it's becoming apparent that the incoming US government might try to use foreign policies guarantees as a leverage in other policy areas. So this one would also go to you, Roderick. For example, if we look at China, because I think this has been mentioned already, that maybe security promises will be linked to European policies in regard to China and to sanctions. How much leeway would you say does the US have at this point to shape US policies on China and to protect on his own interests?
So I think I see 2 points here. One, China could be an asset for Europeans in order to get Trump to toughen up on Russia, because the general situation, in simple terms, or the impression that there is that Trump is soft on Putin but hard on China, and the Europeans are hard on Putin and soft on China. And so the possibility is that the Europeans could say, look, we will toughen up on China a little bit, but you got to be tough on Putin and on Russia as well, because we need a good outcome of this Ukraine war. The other issue that comes in here as well, and this is a factor that Rachel and I did not look at because we looked at the purely security angle, But obviously, the economic angle will also spill over and have an effect. Trump has said he's going to put 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. So if those Chinese goods don't go to the US markets anymore because the tariffs are too high, where are they going to go? They're going to go to Europe. And then if Trump also puts 10% or 20% tariffs on European goods, Europe really risks being squeezed from two sides, from Trump tariffs on their goods, and at the same time, cheap, overly subsidized Chinese goods coming to Europe. And so I think it is actually in Europe's interest or European industrial interest to take a tougher line on China when it comes to economic reciprocity, which the European Commission is already doing. It has a lot of instrument at its disposal. The anti-coercion instrument, for example, the anti-subsidy instrument. And von der Leyen is prepared and has sent soft signals saying that she could use economic security much stronger with regards to China. And so that could be the possibility for transatlantic alignment on China, which could spill over and hopefully move forward transatlantic alignment on Russia. The question indeed will always be, will the European member states be united on this, or will some, like Hungary or others, start falling apart, or even Germany? I mean, look at the electric vehicles case. Germany was also against the tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. So the unity one is the big question there.
Mm-hmm. I would just highlight, though it's very much related. Roderick mentioned earlier in a different context the mindset change. And if you compare mindsets in the US and Europe, 2016 or 2017, the first Trump administration, there is more alignment in Europe on these questions than there was in 2017. So there is a growing consensus also in Europe that China is an economic threat as well as a security threat, and that the Europeans need to respond. This is partly because China is also moving up and threatening high-tech manufacturing, and this gets at the heart of German economy as well. And so the optimistic version, we're focusing very much on the optimistic scenarios today, which is great. I think we all need a little more of that, is that we're in a better starting position to achieve agreement and strategic cohesion than we were in 2017. We, the transatlantic partners, I mean.
Thank you, Rachel. So there is a little bit of positive outlooks we have. But I want to counter the questions now, because we have kind of big questions. So the first one would be, what do you think might be a realistic scenario of an end of the war in Ukraine? What would this mean for regions and cities in the southeast of Ukraine? Rachel.
I mean, I can start. So, I mean, a realistic, slightly optimistic, realistic scenario is, I think we also refer to it in the paper as a West German scenario. And it does mean, I mean, I don't see any realistic scenario where there isn't territory lost. I just don't see that. I also don't see any realistic scenario where the Ukrainian forces get what they need to really change the momentum of the war. I just don't see it. So a realistic scenario is where a territorial agreement is made, which is to the detriment of those territories more or less currently occupied by Russia. Hopefully people who want to leave can leave. Hopefully there's at least European, maybe even transatlantic cooperation on support for the refugees and accepting refugees from that territory, so they don't all, if they don't want to, have to resettle in Ukraine. But that there's then a real financial support, very strong security guarantees, which will have to be at least conventionally mostly European, as we've mentioned, for Ukraine, so that what remains of Ukrainian territory can continue to develop, have a European path in a very secure situation. And I mean, if you think about it that way, the West German scenario, I mean, it's a very optimistic scenario, because as we know, the West German scenario turned into an all of Germany scenario eventually. And so to my mind, that's both realistic as long as the Europeans can step up, as well as, medium and long term could be a very optimistic scenario, but it's of course bitter for the moment. I mean, I don't want to be overly optimistic. It's going to be, bitter for some people, some industries, and for a lot of Ukrainians in the short term. But that's, to me, one realistic scenario, where you have, like, borders that are protected by a kind of European plus UK transatlantic really robust security guarantee in a way, and financial support and all of the things, and a European perspective that allows Ukraine to develop in that way. That's what I see.
Roderick, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. I think there is no way around territorial, de facto territorial concessions, not de jure, so a temporary acceptance of loss of territory. And I think a couple of weeks ago, former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has actually put that on the table and said that in a statement. And I mean, Jens Stoltenberg has never indicated anything to this extent. So I wonder whether it hasn't been actually some of the Trump administration or future Trump staffers who have gone to him and said, look, could you maybe make a statement or make a signal in this direction to get the Europeans to understand that Ukraine will have to temporarily accept the loss of some territories in return for there being a kind of demilitarized zone protected with a strong European peacekeeping force backed up by the US, but also no NATO membership for the moment.
Yeah.
I don't see the kind of West German model where a part of Ukraine joins NATO, maybe in 20 years or something, but for the moment I don't see it. So more of a South Korea, North Korea scenario. And I know it's not a good analogy, and I know the Ukrainians really don't like hearing this, because the difference very simply is in Korea you still have one language, you still have one culture overwhelmingly, whereas in Ukraine the territories that will be under Russian control, they will be Russified, so to speak. They will try to get rid of any signs of Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, and so forth. And that's, of course, the big risk, but I don't see any other way around it. And I thought, Rachel, you made an excellent point earlier, which was that even when the active fighting stops, the indirect fighting will not stop. So even when there is a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement, I think we can just expect Putin to ramp up military production, regroup his troops, and switch from active battlefield fighting on the ground to hybrid operations, cyber attacks, disinformation, misinformation, destabilizing society and the political environment. And I think this is something that the EU and the transatlantic alliance will really have to make sure we're prepared for.
Yeah.
Yes, so the EU has to build up its capabilities. The next question is also what could be the reason and indication that Ukraine war escalates in the wrong direction currently? That would be. Do you have?
I mean, why? The momentum hasn't looked great for Ukraine for a bit now. I'm not a super detailed military expert nor sort of battlefield expert about Ukraine, but they're not getting enough of what they would have needed at the right time. So and they've been fighting with one hand behind their back in terms of not being able to attack in Russian territory until very recently. Many would argue until it was too late, because Russia moved a lot of the assets that would have been important to hit also further from the border. So, Russia is bigger, it has more people. Now they even have North Koreans fighting with them. This was always a war that was going to be very difficult for Ukraine to win. even if there was a moment in the beginning where everyone was quite surprised, and especially with less Western support. And now, of course, it's clear, even though the details are murky, it's clear that the Ukrainians probably cannot count on, unless Putin really misplaces his hand, on support from the US. And so I think all of this is pushing the momentum on Russia's side right now, and I don't see that changing, and I think this is a reality that people are increasingly accepting.
Thank you, Rachel. And we have two last questions. What are your expectations for the European Council next week regarding what has been discussed? Will EU-US relations be discussed on Ukraine? And what do you think on Ukraine?
Well, this is a big question, of course. I think there will be more discussions with regards to financial support and military support for Ukraine. There is the plan to have use the proceeds of the frozen Russian assets from January 2025 onwards. Let me check the figure. I've written it down somewhere. 1.5 billion monthly to Ukraine starting from January 2025. And it would be great to get this moving forward with this European Council as well. There'll be discussions on this peacekeeping force, potentially, given that there have been discussions now with Macron and Trump, and Donald Tusk is bringing people together. And I think these are all stepping stones towards the European Council coming all together and having a common discussions on this. In the past, there have been possible good developments on European military advisors in Ukraine. In the context of the EU training missions for Ukraine, EU MAM or EU MAM, there have been discussions of actually putting European military advisors in Ukraine on the ground. So in accordance with the proposal from Macron to have boots on the ground there, there were very hard discussions. They took place for a very long time. And in the end, 26 member states agreed to have European military advisors in Ukraine. But it was one member state, and you can guess which one, Hungary, that at the very last minute, they hadn't said anything this entire time. They never commented. They just let the discussions go, and they were tough discussions. And in the end, there was an agreement, and then the Hungarians came and blocked it. And so that's one of the concerns that I have as well for next European Council, that it could be the Hungarians still blocking things. Although then Orban might get into a problem with Trump. He claims to have a good relationship, but if he's doing things to undermine European unity and resolve and action and leadership on Ukraine, which is what Trump wants, then Trump could be a wild card here that could push Orban to do more.
Yeah. I mean, this would be the messaging that I would target toward Rubio, toward Mike Waltz. Maybe not Trump so much directly, but I would target that messaging at those two if I was a European, to get Trump to exert pressure on Orban.
Thank you very much. Our time is over, unfortunately. I just wanted to respond to one last question that would ask whether we consulted Ukrainians for this paper. And I don't know whether Roderick and Rachel, you want to say something to this too, but we consulted our colleagues because we have an office that in Kiev, and we included them in this process. And
I can add also,
yeah.
we discussed and presented the paper at our DEEP format, discussions on Eastern European policy in Prague. And at this DEEP format, we also have many Ukrainian experts that participated as well. And so these were confidential discussions, but obviously their perspectives were considered.
Thank you. So thank you very much for all these insights I got today, and thank you everybody for participating. Yes, because we are now on time. If you haven't done so, read the paper. There is much more in it than we could talk about today, and we will stay at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation and follow all these discussions. So I wish you all a wonderful day and thank you very much.